Senator McKenzie.
I rise to speak on the first report of the Commonwealth Bilateral Air Service Agreements. This was the Senate inquiry that didn't have to happen. If the Anthony Albanese's Labor government had have been upfront and explained to the Australian public why it chose to block Qatar Airways' application for more flights and why it decided to put the interests of Qantas above the interests of everyday Australian travellers, this inquiry would never have had to happen. Indeed, this government, and this Prime Minister in particular, chose to look after his corporate crony mates, and in particular the former CEO, Mr Joyce, but more generally the Qantas Group, which, as the inquiry disclosed, as the ACCC has found, as the High Court has made clear, Qantas's corporate behaviour has been appalling. Our once-beloved national carrier has been despicable to its loyal customers, has flagrantly pursued and sacked illegally, it is found, its staff, and it sought to pocket nearly $500 million of its own customers' COVID flight credits. On any measure, Australians are frustrated by the behaviour of the Qantas Group, and that came flowing out during this inquiry. The inquiry heard from over 140 submitters and over 100 everyday Australians putting pen to paper or keyboard to email to vent their frustrations and disappointment in a once-loved national carrier. And rather than be upfront and honest, this government gave 9 different and sometimes contradictory reasons of why it restricted competition and protected one airline's dominant market share over others and kept prices high. Ironically, this committee captured all but the built-up frustrations and traumas of families who've lived through the COVID epidemic when they were unable to fly to reach their loved ones they'd been separated from, and who'd literally been ripped off by a company that they thought had their nation's back, because they love to trot out the national carrier adjective. But when the chips were down, Qantas is nowhere to be found. Frequent flyer points debased, COVID flight credits that could never be used, precious baggage lost, flights delayed and cancelled, not to mention the behaviour of the Qantas board and management towards its loyal and professional staff, while rewarding its departing CEO with an eye-watering golden parachute. Eye-watering, whilst he oversaw the trashing of this once great Australian company's reputation. This inquiry became a lightning rod for all of these frustrations. Nothing more epitomised the out-of-touch arrogance of this corporate than the evidence of Qantas's own Mr Finch, who complained, a man on millions of dollars, who claimed and complained to the senators that he was concerned about a delayed flight out of Canberra Airport. This guy earns enough that he could actually charter his own plane from Qantas to Sydney to make sure he got home that night. What I can confirm is that they made their flight. The flight was held. Ms Hudson made it. But not so for tens of thousands of frustrated Australians who have had to hear those horrible words. Your flight's been delayed, it's been cancelled, we've bumped you to the next one, 3 screaming kids, have to buy new baggage, put you up in a hotel. But the arrogance of Mr Finch honestly beggared belief, and I think touched a nerve, shall we say, in the broader Australian public. And yet the Albanese government at every juncture chose to side with Qantas rather than with the Australian travelling public. It chose to continue its protection racket for Qantas, the flag bearer of its now failed Yes campaign, gagging its public servants, ignoring the advice from eminent ACCC commissioners past and present, ignoring the tourism industry, aviation experts, academics and other airlines. It's still doing this tonight in the midst of the unfolding crisis in the Middle East, where Australians who are trapped in that war zone are hoping to catch Mercy repatriation flights out of Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv back to their loved ones in Australia. Because they're not telling Australians that one of those airlines that offered to help repatriate Australians trying to get out of Israel safely and securely was Qatar Airways, who also helped Australians out of Kabul, who also helped Australians get home to COVID. The government hasn't mentioned their name because it's still running a protection racket for Qantas. The Albanese government are tone-deaf to the issues affecting everyday Australians, and while the government has been solely focused on campaigning on the divisive referendum, the Australian public are simply trying to make ends meet. On July 10, the government blocked the application for Qatar Airways that would have meant that the cost of getting from Australia to Europe through the Middle East would be lower and that you'd have more choice of destination. This Qantas should never have been needed, but it became beholden on the opposition to find out exactly what happened, in whose interests that decision was made, who influenced the decision, and what, if anything, was negotiated in return for this decision that solidified, protected Qantas with its dominant market share in our aviation industry, and particularly after its appalling corporate behaviour. We tried by asking questions in question time. We tried by seeking the production of documents, which I thank crossbench senators and the Greens for also joining with the coalition to get out of the government. Did we get anything? No. So at a last-ditched effort, we put up an inquiry, and I am forever grateful for the crossbench senators who allowed this inquiry to be held. Because the reality is, while the government will trash this inquiry and the report as a political stunt, I would urge anyone who has had an interest in this sector to read the report. The evidence, as I said, was overwhelming. The only submitter who doesn't want the ACCC monitoring of cancellations and delays into the aviation industry, which shows that Qantas delays and cancels flights out of Sydney more than any other airline, despite having the same amount of Air Services Australia staff, despite being subjected to the same weather concerns. It is incredible, but it is the ACCC report that actually made that clear. They don't want it, so the government hasn't done it. The only submitter that doesn't want this decision to be reviewed and for the reasons to be made public and transparent is Qantas. The only one. The academics, the competition experts and the like. We heard from Peter Harris, a former productivity commissioner, a very intelligent and incisive person who conducted a review into the slots going in and out of Sydney Airport. And that review is sitting on the minister's desk right now. She could make decisions right now, based on evidence that's been consulted on, to change the outcome and cancellation and delays in and out of Sydney. But all the crumbs of evidence of why this decision was made, why the minister didn't take her department's advice to approve the negotiating mandate, lead back to three people. Leads back to Albanese, Prime Minister Albanese, Minister King and Mr Joyce. And that is why this committee has asked for, when Mr Joyce does return from overseas, that he will be called before a reconstitution committee to answer the serious and substantial questions that committee members have of him, because he hasn't been upfront. He's been afforded largesse at the expense of staff, of shareholders and customers, and he needs to face the music. I seek leave to continue my remarks.
No, Senator McKenzie, I'm not. You move, as I understand it, you move to take note. Is that correct? Senator Sheldon now wishes to speak, so there's no need to seek leave to continue your remarks. Senator Sheldon, you have the call.
Thank you, Deputy President. I rise to take note of the report on the Select Committee on Commonwealth Bilateral Air Services Agreements. Now, we all know that the Senate and Senate committees actually do extremely important work. I'm sure everyone in this place feels proud of the work they've done through their committee processes, whether it's reviewing legislation or investigating important policy issues. Given all the vital, important work that the Senate does, it is unfortunate when the Senate resources are tied up in political stunts like this inquiry. At a time when there are many important issues we could be looking into, we've instead been required to participate in this circus. A circus where the chair of the committee refused to provide programs to government senators in advance of hearings, making it impossible to adequately prepare. A circus where the chair of the committee was making public announcements about committee decisions, often before the decisions had even been agreed to. A circus where all the conventions about how committees should operate were thrown into the bin. A circus where we had to endure lengthy lines of questioning from those opposite that had absolutely nothing to do with the terms of reference, and in some cases had absolutely nothing to do with the aviation industry at all. Now, there were at least half an hour of questioning at one point about the voice to Parliament and, yes, 23 decals on Qantas planes. And even the absolutely ridiculous suggestion there was a link between the Yes campaign and a bilateral air services agreement decision. Now, this inquiry about bilateral air service agreements was weaponised yet as another disinformation campaign against the voice. Now, it's not only a complete waste of all our time, it undermines and erodes faith in democracy in this country when such ridiculous accusations are made. It's particularly frustrating when the aviation industry actually does face many challenges that deserve proper and serious consideration, and I'll touch on those very shortly. But it's also very, very clear that this committee is not an appropriate vehicle for a serious investigation of anything. The suggestion that this committee should be given even more time and resources to run a disinformation campaign about the voice is frankly obscene. Now, as Senator White and I noted in our dissenting report, this inquiry did not reveal a single piece of information that was not already on the public record. Not a single piece. It did not reveal a single piece of evidence proving that Qantas has influence over the current government. In fact, the only evidence Qantas influence over government decisions-making pertained to the previous government and the previous Minister for Transport, Michael McCormack. As the committee had heard, Brisbane Airport was informed back in April 2018 that Qatar Airways was going to be given additional access to these markets. And then a week later, without warning, without explanation, there was a complete backflip on that decision. From what we can tell, the only relevant event that happened in the course of that week was that Mr McCormack hired an Qantas executive as his chief of staff, and then suddenly had a change of heart about Qatar Airways market access. Now, of course, all of this was already on the public record. It was reported in the Courier Mail 5 years ago. We didn't need to have a Senate inquiry to find that out either. We just needed internet access. It was well and truly a matter of public record, and has been for many years that Liberals and Nationals are captured by Qantas. I was there when Ansett collapsed, and the Howard government sat on its hands and let it happen to the great benefit of Qantas. I was there when Alan Joyce became Qantas CEO, and the first thing he did was begin setting up labour hire companies to undercut Qantas' long-standing workplace agreements, all with the explicit support of the Liberals and Nationals. I was there when Alan Joyce grounded the entire Qantas fleet in 2011 because some of their workers were wearing the wrong coloured ties as a form of industrial action. And again, the Liberals and Nationals supported Joyce the whole way. I was there when Alan Joyce successfully lobbied the Morrison government to let Virgin collapse during the pandemic, while they gave Qantas $2.7 billion with no obligation. And I was there when Alan Joyce had legally sacked 1,700 people. This government intervened in that case on behalf of those workers. That's what the previous government wouldn't do. Minister McCormick said illegally sacking 1,700 people, and I quote, in the best interest of the company going forward. In the best interest of the company going forward. Christian Porter said illegally sacking 1,700 people was, I quote, a good model. Senator Cash said of illegally sacking 1,700 people, and I quote, Qantas are entitled to make those decisions. Now, either those three ministers have been improperly influenced by Qantas, or they just generally supported Alan Joyce destroying the lives of thousands of people. Which one is it? And literally as we speak, the Liberals and Nationals are standing hand in hand with Qantas to try to stop us from closing Alan Joyce's labour hire loophole. The loophole he created to split the Qantas workforce across 38 different companies to divide and tear them apart. The Liberals and Nationals could stand with aviation workers and support closing the loophole. But no, they're standing with Alan Joyce, Richard Goyder and the Qantas board. Now, there is decades of evidence of the Liberals and Nationals standing hand in hand with Qantas, and particularly with Alan Joyce, as he destroyed the airline. The Liberals and Nationals never cared for a second about what happened to those workers. Now, they're happy for Alan Joyce to ruin their lives and livelihoods of thousands of Qantas workers and their families, but putting a yes sticker on a plane is where they draw the line. My God. Which brings me back to the fact that those opposite have never demonstrated they care about our aviation industry. For 9 years, they took absolutely no steps to act on the issues that are clearly within the sector. Upon coming to government, Minister King quickly established the Green Paper and the White Paper process so that we can have a thoughtful and considered approach to resolving these issues. There has been wide and extensive consultation through that process. Unlike the sham inquiry pursued by this committee, the White Paper process can solve important problems. Problems like the systematic destruction of aviation workforce. Problems like the lack of consumer rights under the previous government's watch. And protections for anti-competitive behaviour. Cancellations and gouging. These are real problems and they deserve real solutions, not political stunts.
Senator Smith, are you speaking on this particular report?
I am.
That's all right. If you're the last speaker, can I ask you, Seek Lead, to continue your remarks, as it seems to be a report that members are interested in?
To oblige. There's two very, very dry words in Australian politics at the moment. One is the word productivity and the other word is competition. I'll talk about productivity reforms and why they're so necessary for our economy at another time. But front and centre for many, many Australians now is the unreasonableness, the high cost and unreliability of service when it comes from the Australian airline industry in delivering important aviation needs to Australian consumers. I think for a long time in Australia, aviation and travel and the connectivity that it delivers has been regarded as a luxury item. But if there's a learning, from the COVID experience, it is that aviation has become much more of an essential service for Australians than a luxury good. An essential service because we know that increasingly Australians want to be able to travel to stay connected to their families in good times like Christmas and birthday celebrations, but also connected to their families in times of tragedy or unseen and unfortunate circumstances. And that's particularly true of the increasing number of multicultural communities in our country that don't just want to stay connected to their communities here in Australia, but are particularly keen and interested and, out of necessity, want to stay connected with their families and with their communities abroad. It's clear from the report that Senator McKenzie has delivered to the Senate this afternoon that competition needs in regards to the Australian aviation sector are in urgent and immediate reform. And it's very, very curious, in fact, that the government has decided to establish a competition review process, which I've got to say is very unstructured, doesn't have the discipline of priorities, nor does it have the discipline of publicly stated timeframes, a competition review process that has consciously, at the beginning, ignored the importance of aviation issues and in sort of hastily convened backflipping on behalf of the Treasurer, Dr Chalmers, and the government's competition minister, Mr Lee, have belatedly decided to include aviation issues in that competition review, but not committed to make them a priority of the review's inquiry process, nor established a timeline in regards to how and when those aviation considerations will be contemplated by the competition review mechanism. Instead, they're saying, oh no, we've got a green and white paper process which will put these important issues out on the never-never, and I predict with great confidence that we will not see one competition initiative presented to this parliament before the next election. Not one. So despite the COVID experience and everything that it taught us about the importance of aviation in our country, both from a business and freight perspective, but also from a social perspective, despite the fact we have a decision in regards to greater access to an airline like Qatar, which is a decision, the government's decision which is friendless, we will not see, despite all of that, we will not see one positive competition reform initiative brought to this parliament before the next election through the competition review process. That is the government. That is the government being blind and deaf to the needs of Australian consumers. And in the last day or so, as a result of the weekend's very, very decisive rejection of the government's key priority, key constitutional priority, the rejection of that by Australians, the government has been quickly trying to sort of make up for lost time, frantically now focusing on cost of living attention issues, but continuing to ignore the desperate need this country has for significant improvements in aviation competition. Because there's one particular initiative the government could take immediately. Doesn't need a review process, doesn't need legislative reform. The one initiative they could take immediately would be to reinstate the ACCC monitoring regime for the airline industry. The 13th and final report of that regime was released in June, and every single stakeholder that presented to Senator McKenzie's Committee of Inquiry, every single stakeholder, other airlines, airport operators, the travel industry, said that the government should reinstate that ACCC monitoring regime because it was good for the industry, it was good for the transparency, it was good for scrutiny. But who is the one organisation? Who is the one organisation that continues to resist the reinstatement of that ACCC monitoring regime? A guess starts with Q, followed by A, followed by N, followed by T, followed by A, followed by S. Qantas is the only organisation in this whole country that does not want that ACCC monitoring regime introduced. And guess who is listening to Qantas? The government. The government. Indeed, the Qantas CEO at the committee inquiry said, we don't support a continuation of that review because the findings were not significant. The findings were not significant was the view that the new Qantas CEO had, when in actual fact the report made numerous findings in regards to competition, consumer protections, poor flight regularity, poor service for customers, and the Qantas CEO, the only organisation in this whole country, other than the government, that doesn't want to see the ACCC monitoring regime reintroduced. How remarkable. And government senators have the gall to stand up here and argue that Qantas is not abusing its monopoly position in the Australian aviation market by standing over the government, standing over Dr Chalmers, standing over Assistant Minister Lee, and saying, we don't want that report, that monitoring regime reinstated. What a simple, easy, relatively inexpensive opportunity in the context of the government's huge expenditure. Nothing. It would cost the government nothing relatively to reintroduce that and give the industry greater transparency, greater scrutiny, and reassure Australian aviation customers that they were not being ripped off. Because if you're an Australian aviation consumer at the moment, your starting position should absolutely be, I'm getting lower levels of standards, I'm getting poor reliability, and I'm probably being ripped off. And for someone like myself who comes from Western Australia, has to travel across the continent regularly, I do so willingly, someone who travels around Western Australia, which I do willingly, I know and I hear the poor experience that my constituents keep telling me about when it comes to aviation experience. There's another issue in the report, and which was canvassed in the inquiry, that has received less attention. And I readily accept that it's probably not widely endorsed by many people in our country just yet. But that is the restrictive practice that air cabotage plays on denying a better economic development story and economic development opportunities for Northern Australia. I do not believe, and I don't think anyone in this country believes, there should be wholesale lifting of those restrictions. But I do believe, and I hope that others in this chamber do believe, there's an opportunity to review some routes and look at some opportunities where we can provide greater access to regional Australians living across the north of our continent, better access to freight, better access to passenger flights, and there's a real opportunity here. And I think the answer is in giving greater access to low-cost carriers, not the big multinational sovereign-backed carriers, but smaller, low-cost carriers to travel into our country to pick up and drop off aviation customers in Kununurra and Derby and Broome and other places across northern Queensland that Senator McDonald will be more familiar with than I. So this is a necessary report. I think it has done great work. I compliment Senator McKenzie and Senator Birmingham for their great effort in this. I'm disappointed that Senator Sheldon and others haven't seen the real opportunity for significant improvements in aviation services in our country that this report presents, and I hope that others will give it due consideration over coming days. And I encourage the government to reinstate the ACCC monitoring report, and I seek leave to continue my remarks.